All right. The survivors. You made it. It's almost on like the last. And I always joke that I'm in the sort of, it's a bit like being the diver in the shark cage. Like I am standing between all of you and drinks outside. So I know that my sort of position, I'm here by the grace of your patience, but probably not too much patience, which is good because I only have about half an hour. And so I think we'll all be able to go out and we have beautiful sunshine to talk about the crazy ideas that I'm about to throw out here. In terms of expectation setting for this talk, this is really intended as a precursor to a long and passionate discussion over drinks and not as a kind of well and cogently reasoned scientific paper or something like that. So expect more crazy ideas that will make you scratch your head than, you know, things where you come away thinking, well, that's obvious. I'll start with that. So the background to this, you notice there's already a slight, wow, it turned into the grand. I said I cheated a little bit in preparing these slides. I was like, oh my God, that sounds very grand. Like, I know a friend of mine is doing the grand unified theory of monitoring. I didn't want to try and stand in his footsteps. I'd actually cheated and made the slides a grand unified theory. But Gottfried spotted that clearly. And so we're now back with the most grandiose claim that you could possibly make. Right, so what's the background to this? Well, the background to this a little bit is that obviously I spend too much probably of my time trying to think about how the various things that you are all trying to do and people we see in the market and the poster children and the laggards and so on, what they're trying to do. And so one example was I was at a KitCon, highly recommended by the way. KitCons can be very different depending on where you go. They're CI and testing conferences, but really there are total open spaces. And so we had very interesting discussions with some people who are now CTOs of companies, basically trying to figure out what running a modern IT organization means today. And so the conversations range from like how to compensate people fairly and motivate them to what kind of technologies to use, kind of very broad spectrum stuff. And then thanks to Gene, obviously, for putting together a great DevOps enterprise forum. That was a kind of little part two of this, similar discussions where we were talking about, you know, seeing a whole different spectrum when you get into a larger problem space of trying to actually transform an enterprise, that it's not just about the technology and about architecture choices and about legacy stuff, but also about culture and all this kind of stuff. And so there's a lot of these different, okay, this is the agenda. I will go through this. So there's a lot of, the genesis for this is a little bit, you know, lots of different discussions I've had where I tend to every now and again get the feel that we're actually talking about something that has a sort of similar underlying theme, but we're always approaching it from a slightly different way. I'm not going to do the elephant analogy because we have too many of those. And I think the elephant analogy will be a little bit like, you know, the floppy disk. The kids don't know what it is anymore. Like in like 50 years, elephants, unfortunately, will probably be extinct. And so when people do this analogy of the elephant, like the next generation will not even know what we're talking about. What is this elephant thing they talk about? Anyway, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the vocabulary of modern IT. That's just a sort of recapitulation of buzzwords and phrases thrown out to see how much kind of recognition we get. And then I'm going to do the crazy thing to try to attempt a unification. And I'm going to speculate a little bit, assuming in the wild case that this might be somewhat true, what some of the consequences of that might be. And then, you know, make a little segue into how we and how some of the stuff you've heard earlier today fits in, sort of dovetails with this kind of thinking. I'm not sure why monkey programming is exactly the kind of icon we want here, but anyway. So here's some of the terms that I think fall within the spectrum of these varied discussions that I've been having. Obviously, DevOps, continuous delivery, all the standard ones. Agile still comes up. Unsurprisingly, microservices, and these are all, we're starting with the known ones, like reactive architecture or event-driven architecture, whatever you want to call it. Some people call it service-based, or the regenesis of service-based, or service-oriented architecture. People talked about the Spotify model a lot, or product teams, if you want to call them that, if you don't want to like give a company credit for coming up with this. Then obviously there's the whole cloud container serverless thing, like technology, underlying technology. And then there's, to pick Amazon's phrase, but many companies have talked about it this in a different way, customer obsession. And so these are all kind of, I think, topics that let's have it. Who here recognizes these in the sort of daily, monthly, weekly strategic discussions that you end up having in your organizations about where you need to go and where you need to do? I know it's 4:30. Very good. Don't be shy. Excellent, excellent. Oh, there's lots of people who don't talk about any of these things at all. That's also good. Anyway. So I think, you know, this is the kind of when we're not trying to put out the database that's on fire and when we're actually trying to think about where strategically we want to go. I think a lot of these are the sort of topics that we talk about a little bit. But the interesting thing for me is when I sort of reflected on where I was having these conversations, it was always a little bit fragmented. It felt like I was going to one cubicle and I was having a discussion with maybe the VP of product or something about customer obsession. How do we make our teams understand? How do we make our organization more obsessed about the customer? And then you'd go over to the next cubicle with the VP of engineering or the chief architect, and you talk about cloud, container, and serverless and how you were going to do that. And then, so all these different topics come up, but they never come up with some kind of holistic discussion. Different people seem to regard that as being their particular problem space, and then you go read some blog post in which somebody says, yeah, but you can't, if you want to do microservices, you have to have product teams. And then somebody says, oh, well, if you want to have product teams, you have to have customer obsession. And then somebody says, if you want to have, it's a sort of weird game of DevOps rock, paper, scissors. And there doesn't seem to be like people sort of seeing or trying to see this as that they're all different facets of the same underlying problem. So we've talked about bridges today earlier. I'm going to continue on this sort of physical theme. Now let's go totally grand. It's 4:30. We're almost done. Let's try to go from physical stuff to physics, right? So those of you who have a bit of a physics background will know what this is. This is the today. These are the forces we see all around us that make our microchips work and make our brains work and do all these wonderful things. And then there's this grand thing, which is called, basically what the entirety of the physics community has tried to do for hundreds and hundreds of years, and most likely will continue to do, which is to try to figure out how to unify these things. So without too much, not to digress too much, but this is the point. So clearly, we haven't actually, we don't know what this is yet. This is why it's a speculative talk. But we've done this. This is the standard model. This was finished with the Higgs boson. That's what everybody was shouting about. And we still have to figure out this one. So these are all, we see these today, but they're all part of some sort of strange, same underlying thing, and now we're working really hard to try and figure out how they all fit together. So the question for me, that was a little too fast. The question for me is, so assuming we try to do something similar for all these disjointed conversations that we're having about everything from culture to containers, if you like. Spotify model to serverless. Oh, nice alliterations there. So we try to do that nice academic exercise, 4:30 in the afternoon. Will that get us anywhere? Is that useful, actually? Is it even possible? And then can we learn something from it? And now, my next slide, I believe the answer is yes. Having tried to do this a little bit, having tried to think about the sort of commonalities here, can we learn something from them? I think so. And so that's essentially what I would like to share and encourage conversations around whether I'm totally wrong or whether this is useful or not. All right. So, just picking 4 randomly there, nicely spread across the spectrum. These are the 4 of the sort of forces that we observe today. The big question is, what is this thing, right? What's that thing at the back there? And so if I think about all these, and if I kind of do the Agile 5 whys and think about these conversations I'm having in the various cubicles about what it is that the VP of engineering is trying to achieve, that the VP of product is trying to achieve, that the CIO is trying to achieve, that the team lead is trying to achieve, I think a lot of it can sort of be summed up in this rather awkward, sort of bit of a mouthful-y sentence, which is the ability for software teams to quickly and autonomously ship useful software on an ongoing basis. It seems pretty similar to the sort of continuous delivery or agile mantra, the second bit of the Agile Manifesto, customer value, ongoing basis. But I think there's a few additions in here that are kind of important, and we'll talk about the implications of this. But as I said, this is a bit of a sort of clunky thing to put on a bumper sticker. It's slightly too long. So let's maybe call it maximal flow. Take it. What do I mean by that? So there was a very interesting session. I think IT Revolution will probably publish a paper on this a little bit about flow-based architecture. I'm not necessarily going to take it quite as far as that. That was an interesting workshop session, which talks about the implications for trying to achieve this on-product architecture and whether that works or not, digression. What I mean by this is that what I think a lot of organizations are trying to figure out is how I can, not necessarily how can I produce the biggest value, because that would allow you to do classic waterfall stuff, huge, big applications, but take 6 months to deliver them, and then boom, like Oracle 11G or whatever lands on your desk. But how do you make a team, and not just a team, an organization that is able to maximally push new stuff out there and continue to do that? And those of you who've read Jeff Bezos' most recent shareholder letter, essentially he speaks about entirely that. Like his view as a CEO of Amazon, enormous company now selling us our organic food, he feels that his entire problem is how to keep Amazon what he calls a type 1 company. Not a type 2 company, which is top-down control, a type 1 company, which allows teams to do this. So interesting read, by the way. It's public information because it's a shareholder's letter, so you can just Google for it. You can find it. So let me talk a little bit about, speeding ahead here. Finished a little bit early. Let me talk a little bit about some of the implications of this. Let's go back to the clunky version, the long sentence. Ability for software teams to quickly and autonomously ship useful software on an ongoing basis. So the first thing I think to conclude from this is it's all about shipping software. By implication, shipping software to production. So that, I think, implies some kind of a DevOpsy mindset. It applies some kind of notion that you perceive of the work of the people who can write code as going beyond just writing code and putting it in a repository, but actually going out and getting it running and feeling that that's part of their job and part of the part of the scope of work that they're signing up for. So that kind of, yes, there's a connection there. So you can't really do this without having, I think, a sort of DevOpsy mentality. Quickly, I think that's what justifies the whole cloud, container, serverless dimension. Because if you want to do it quickly, you can't do it if you're choosing new technologies when you have to provision stuff really, it takes 6 months to do something, you're definitely not going to do anything quickly. So in order to be able to ship quickly, you need, I think we all accept that as an underlying sort of prerequisite, not particularly interesting, it's just a necessity, the ability to get infrastructure on demand as needed. So that's how that ties into this sort of bigger picture. On an ongoing basis, so that's the antithesis of this whole big, enormous release, boom, idea. And that implies, if you want to do this, that implies some kind of notion of working iteratively. That's where the drive comes from, to have a process that allows you to do small stuff regularly. And that's what implies, whether you do Kanban or Agile or Lean or just sticky notes by the freezer, also fine. And that's, of course, that's the sort of project management side of it, is this iterative development process. The technical part of this that you need in order to make this work is some sort of continuous delivery pipeline-ish setup. Because it's all very well to deliver fast, so that's combining the notion of end-to-end with iterative gets you agile and continuous delivery in here. Okay, so we've managed to derive these so far. Now the more interesting ones come in. Autonomously and useful. So useful for me implies customer obsession. Useful implies that, well, let's do it the other way around. Autonomously implies that you don't have an executive telling a product manager what to do, or a VP of product management who in turn tells 20 product managers what to do, who in turn pre-bake backlogs for 50 development teams, who in turn develop a whole bunch of stuff without really having any idea of what it is that stuff is supposed to do. And then you go back and the classic finding, I've repeated it many times, famous study, Microsoft, I think it was about Internet Explorer, did a sort of study on the impact of the features they were shipping, and they found that roughly a third of the features that they were shipping had positive impact on their users. A third was sort of neutral, a third negative. People are smart, they don't hire idiots, right? Top-down product management results, at least in that case, a third of the stuff they were shipping was not just doing nothing, it was detrimental to the product, like not clearly where we want to be. So if we want to allow people to do things autonomously, we have to give them the ability to do this. We have to give them the freedom, and I'll talk more about this in the sort of intelligence section, to make their own decisions and then to use the shipping part to actually get that to production. And that's all very well to say that we should empower people and give them freedom and motivate them and blah, very nice sort of cuddly stuff. But I can tell you for a fact, take a bunch of, well, certainly if you took me and you transport me back 10 years before I started thinking about this and you said, go build something, you have freedom to go to production. I would have built something that was nice for me, whether it was actually useful for the kind of people who work for our company, totally open question. And that's, I think, one of the hardest parts, thinking back about what the change it implies. But again, let me not skip ahead here. This is where the customer obsession bit comes in. Like, if you want teams to act autonomously and yet still do stuff that is useful, they have to care about your business. They have to care about your customers. They have to know about what your customers do and what their business is. That's hard enough already in a lot of companies. But then they have to care about making that work. And I think anybody who's worked in a large enterprise will recognize that it's a very hard thing to do. And in some industries, I would say it's almost impossible to do, because clearly, I mean, TJ, very interesting story actually, if you speak to him about a development team where you're developing medical devices for old people falling down stairs kind of stuff. That's something that's very difficult to empathize with until you have a grandmother or until you've broken a leg or something like that. But modulo the fact that there's lots of challenges here, I think that's what implies, if we want people to autonomously ship useful stuff, that's what implies that we both give them the autonomy and that we are able to trust that they will do sensible things, directionally correct things with it. And incidentally, of course, if you try to do the Venn diagram and you look at famous companies that are supposedly poster children in this space, this is one of the things Amazon claims that they do rigorously and manage to produce the worst UI in the history of mankind in the AWS console and still be a market leader. Now that's power. A few more. Okay, so I've belabored the autonomously bit a lot. If you want to do quickly and autonomously, you can't have a monolithic architecture. Because a monolithic architecture it doesn't imply that you're doing things autonomously, but you definitely, as we all know, are not going to be able to move quickly. Unless you have a single team, and there's plenty of companies that do that. MailChimp, it's an enormous MySQL application. Still works. I love MailChimp. At some point, it's going to stop. And so that's where you need an architecture that reflects the autonomously bit in order to allow people to move quickly. And that's when you get decoupled architectures or microservices or reactive or event-driven. I mean, these are not quite the same thing. You can have microservices that are totally not event-driven. Microservices are just more about the bounded context idea. But if you look at, say, a modern big data pipeline or something like that, the other notion is that you decouple teams from each other by essentially not allowing them to depend tightly on each other's interfaces. So you can say, like, oh, look, I have a new customer in my database. I don't care whether you understand my customer schema or not. I care whether you're up or not as a consumer application. I'm just going to dump it into Kafka or Kinesis or whatever, and then you can read it when you want to or if you want to. And that allows for decoupling. Otherwise, I want to add a field to my customer record. I have to call around all the other teams that are going to get a call because they've subscribed to some kind of webhook, and then they're going to break, blah, and then that takes forever to get this customer field changed. All right, been through a bunch of stuff there. So long story short, I'm not going to rewind all the slides, but I think this rather convoluted-ish sentence, if I think about the spectrum of technologies, enabling technologies, sort of methodologies, attitudes, cultures, I think it captures quite well what we're trying to do. And I think if we can do this, then we are really on the way to achieving fast flow and throughput. And again, this is not necessarily saying that we maximize, say, over a year's period of time, the total cumulative value delivered, because you can do that pretty nicely in large waterfall things. This maximizes for any given moment of time the value that we're pushing out right now. And I think that's what companies are really concerned about, that they don't have that ability. That's what a lot of C-level people we speak to are trying to drive. All right, what does this imply? Now the even more crazy speculation starts. First of all, that you need, if you're going to do one of your digital transformation or age of the customer or whatever your favorite analyst calls it, projects, you have to look at it holistically. You can't just do the microservices with the containers and then have one single team to do all of it. Because it sounds nice, but you then get the same microservice spaghetti that you get with any other monolithic, not architecture, but with the monolithic development team, because it's way too easy for everything to call everything else. What microservices do and what they expose is discipline around interfaces. That's what's important. You can do a microservices thing without separating the processes out, but it's the inability to randomly call into the back end of the other application and pull this value out that you're not supposed to have. That's what drives the decoupling and the autonomy that's so important. But It goes beyond the architecture and the technology. It also goes into that team structure bit, and it goes into what drives those teams. Technical capability without autonomy will get you more efficiency, but it will not get you innovation, right? If you give people the clouds and containers and the ability to do on-demand VMs and all that stuff, yeah, they'll be faster. They won't spend 6 weeks waiting around for somebody to approve a VM. That's great. But they will have no clue. I mean, they'll fix a bunch of tech debt. Great. They'll fix their CI build pipeline. They'll parallelize the tests. They'll get stuff to run faster. Do they have any idea what to build better? Most likely not. That's where the mentality part comes in. That's where you need to give people understanding. And you can't expect the team tomorrow to wake up and understand all this. You have to enable them with intelligence. We'll get to that in a sec. Autonomous teams require decoupled architectures. That's basically a reformulation of the whole kind of genesis of the Spotify idea. If you have autonomous teams, but you force them to work in a coupled architecture, then they're really not autonomous. That's a kind of a contradiction in terms. And you can turn it around. Decoupled architectures kind of promote autonomous teams. I've kind of already said this one. And the final one, the nice segue to, well, wow, what do we do about this? How do we help? Unified data and unified intelligence are key to make this work. So not unified data, that's good already to start with, but actually unified intelligence. Right, so what do I mean by that? So what I mean by that is that going back to these conversations in all the different silos, basically a lot of the intelligence in organizations, if I think about it, the kind of information and understanding that is necessary to power the kind of autonomy that I've just talked about lives in the heads of the CEO, the VP of product, and they kind of share it secretly. They go to a little meeting, have dinner, and they talk about this stuff. And none of this stuff is accessible to a large part of the organization. And you can't have autonomy if this essential knowledge about company strategy, about customer behaviors, customer needs, is locked away in a very small group of people that sort of disperse it, trickle down, as and when they think it's needed. And so what you see in organizations that manage to make this change is that this sort of secret, commercially sensitive information is not regarded as so secret that the teams aren't even supposed to know it. That doesn't mean that everybody, every developer on every team sees everything, the balance sheet of the entire company, the P&L, whatever. But it means that if you're working in one of these bounded teams, say Spotify, I don't know, Netflix's team to like optimize their CDN for Asia Pac or whatever, then you get to see all the data about Asia Pac, not just the New Relic stuff about CPU usage and bandwidth, but customer behavior, what videos they want to watch, what times of the day they want to watch it, what they're building, whatever. Like, you get to see the stuff that's important to understand the actual product piece that you're delivering. And you understand what the goals are for that product piece. What do we want to do? Do we want to make it faster? Do we want to make it cheaper? Do we want to get more customers? Do we want to get better retention? Like, that stuff has to be available for the team. So I think this is the age of saying, okay, well, we have the business analyst who's going to look at the product data, like the sales data, the conversion rates. And we have the ops person who's going to look at New Relic and slather away over the disk, inode usage. And the developer who's going to look at features and commits and, static code analysis numbers. This sort of separation of data into 3 different chunks for 3 different people, or n different chunks for n different people, depending on how many dot stars you put into dev, dot star, ops, needs to go away. So if we want to actually take one of these teams and we want to kind of multiply it out into this sea of autonomous teams, we need to figure out a way to make this data more holistically accessible. And as I said, this is not necessarily about like access control. It's more about thinking of data as the reference here from, say, Future, obviously is underpants profit, so, a bit in the middle. The important thing here is that, I lost myself with that reference. No, the thing I was trying to say is that if you look at it's more about thinking of the holisticity, which doesn't exist as a word, of the types of data that have to go together. It's the data from product management. It's the data about the features. It's the data about, we're building these stories, but why are we building them? What are they motivated by? What customer input came in? Stuff that traditionally lives in the product management's data silo and then gets converted into sort of technical stories by some magical process, which then is associated with a bunch of commits and tests and code quality ratios and throughput times and failures, the kind of stuff you get in extra release and so on, deployments, and then you get some operational metrics on the other end, and then somebody runs an ETL process on top of Splunk to try to extend and mixes it with your credit card processing data, which lives in a different system. If you can think of this holistic chain as one data set, even if it's for a single product, not for the entire company, but of one data set, and you can give the teams access to this data set, then together with the right motivation to do the right things with this data and the autonomy and the technology to do that, then they can really innovate. Then they can drive improvement, and then you get profit. I think on that note, I will leave you and say thank you very much.